Our guest for today's episode is Viba Mohan. She is graduating from PES University in Interaction Design and is working as a product designer at Obvious. She has also worked at the Solar Labs and interned at Chumbak Design. I am Mayank Khandelwal and you are listening to Whiteboard.fm. Hi Viba, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
Good, good. So let's get started with the interview. The first question, how did you get started in design?
I feel like it was inevitable for me to get into design. Back when I first started, it felt like I stumbled into it, but in hindsight, it seems kind of obvious. I remember as a kid, the only things that I really enjoyed were making things and solving problems. And by the time I got to 12th grade, there was this huge tech boom, right? Like everyone was talking about UX, everyone was talking about software engineering, and everyone was talking about products. And I think it was just natural for me also to just get into that drift, especially since I was a little more visually inclined in that sense. And yeah, I feel like it just happened. I don't think it was a very glamorous story.
Okay, nice. And what was your first design project like? What was your
My
experience?
first project.
Your first design project. What was it and what was your experience?
I think my experience was very ambiguous. So this was when I was in my first semester of college. I started interning at this cafe where they wanted me. I mean, not interning. I was freelancing for a cafe where they wanted me to make a bunch of graphics for their um, in-house artwork, and it was very overwhelming because I obviously felt like I didn't deserve to be having a job at all that was there, and also just that was the first time that I was dealing with a client per se, where and it was super overwhelming because I did not know how to handle interactions, what cadence of communication to maintain. But yeah, shortly after that, I was just freelancing all the time. Like after that, I remember simultaneously I picked up a bunch of other things as well, like illustration and web design. So I was just working on multiple things, and I think the learning curve was pretty steep.
Nice. So you've interned and you're working at Obvious right now, right? So how did you apply to Obvious?
Uh, when I first applied, I did not know about Obvious or Uncommon, as it was called back then. I had put up a tweet saying that I needed an internship, and I had put up my portfolio with it. So Rahul, who's the founder of Obvious, reached out and he said, "Why don't you apply to Obvious?" And I hadn't heard about them, but it was really odd because on the same day, three other people also told me to apply to the same company. So I was like, okay, maybe I should give this a shot, right? I mean, if so many people think it's a great idea, maybe they're right. And I did. But at the same time, if I'm being honest, back then I was so sure that I wouldn't go there because I did not think that I would want to stay with a consultancy. I felt like I would much rather work at a product company, and I already had a bunch of offers. But so before the interview, I was very skeptical. And I think this is what you're actually asking, right? Like, why did I choose to go to Obvious? Is probably more the question. So once I got to the interview, I just knew that this was the place because it wasn't the toughest interview, but it was the most rewarding because throughout, Akshay, who also ended up being my mentor through the internship, he just kept grilling me with really tough questions. But unlike typical interviews where they would stop with the questioning, so he would make me reconsider what I had done, and he would push me to think better. And eventually the conversation also just evolved into why design and what about design really pulled me. And he was kind of like just breaking down everything that I knew about design and like being like, everything you know is wrong, but he did it so politely that I felt like, wait, this is exactly where I need to be. This is where I'm going to learn the most. So that's why Obvious.
That's really nice. So like I was like from the question of what made you apply to Obvious to you also shared how did you get in Obvious? Or is there more that you
Mhm.
can share in terms of how did you apply for it?
So the process was fairly straightforward. I
Yeah.
sent in my application over email. Back then, they didn't have a very formal process for internships. Then, in about a week, Akshay got back to me. He was also my interviewer. So he said, "Would you like to come down for an interview?" And I said, "Yeah." And we scheduled it for about a month later, actually, because like we just couldn't find a timeline that worked for both of us. And then I was set to have a 1 hour long interview, except it became 2.5 hours long. So yeah, that was pretty much the process. And then I think even after the interview, in about an hour, he sent me a mail saying, "Hey, we'd like you to join." So yeah, that was pretty straightforward.
Also,
That,
can you share your portfolio and tell us more about what your process was in creating your portfolio and how you structured it and why?
sure. This is my portfolio website, which kind of just hosts everything that I typically present in a portfolio review round. So the way that I structured this is that I wanted it to cover a couple of things, right? So if you look at this right side section, you have work, design writing, resume, and about. For me, I knew that one thing that sort of made me stand out was my experience with writing about design, because that's how I typically articulate my thoughts, and that is something that I knew was a plus point for me. And that's also why this header is structured in the way that it is, right? Where okay, so my header is structured in the way that it is because of two reasons. One is that I wanted to highlight what I've done so far, and two, I don't actually have a lot to show for in terms of work anymore because I haven't put up my projects recently. So I knew that it was essentially just going to be like a resume of sorts. So which is why I started with a designer with an interest in writing, and
Right.
then I followed it up with what kind of work I've done in the past. And this is a slightly old header. I am not open to consultant or freelance opportunities. This was right after journey is when I last updated it. And as we scroll down, I have only 3 projects on my portfolio website. I chose these 3 because I wanted to cover 3 main things. One was depth of work, breadth of work, and drive. So drive would be covered by this Lollipop Designathon because it was a designathon, right? I mean, it doesn't have enough depth and it doesn't have enough breadth because it's just one night. How much can you do? But it did show that I was going out of my way to participate in activities, and I felt like that was something that was central to the way I work, a strong bias for action, if you will. So the second is Chumbak, which I would say is breadth of work because it was graphic design, which is completely out of my comfort zone. I do not typically design graphics. But I had taken up that internship about 1.5 years ago just to explore and see if this is something that I could possibly be interested in. And my work isn't great, but it shows that I, have tried and that I have
That's fine.
experimented.
It's meant to
And
show
then
growth.
and finally, there is the Solar Labs, which is my actual product design work. So in my head, this is depth of work because this is one project that I was on for about 4 months, where I walked through the entire, what is the product strategy? What is the business strategy? What is the user goals? How do I translate these into design decisions? And how do I translate this into outcomes, right? Like tangible business measurable business outcomes. So that's essentially how I structured that part.
Right.
And below this, I have the footer where it's just, I don't know, I guess adding a personal touch, just like talking about who I am. Would you like me to go through the projects
Sure.
specifically?
Definitely.
So with Chumbak, this is typically not the style of presentation that I follow. Normally, I have a brief about what my roles, what kind of project it was, and so on and so forth. And it's normally very textual, followed by the final visuals, by the final designs. But with Chumbak, since this was graphic design, I decided to change it up a bit and keep it a little more. Um, I mean, like these are literally just images that I've uploaded. That is not what I normally do. So with Chumbak, I was working as a design intern with the branding and marketing team for about 3 months. This was right after my second year of college. So please refrain judgment. I wasn't very good back then. So a little more about the role is that Chumbak is a design first lifestyle brand. They started off with a very quirky, edgy look to their products, but over time they kind of started veering towards something that's a little more minimal. When I joined, that's when they started pivoting towards something that's a little more minimal, right? Like, so they were making that transition, and that was a very interesting thing to watch. So, in fact, that's why I wrote similar to Kat Kitson, even though originally that is not what their brand was. So throughout my internship it was about 2 months, I did some visuals for the store. I worked on social media posts and newsletters. I worked on brand rebranding, and I worked in a very cross-functional team. So even though I was a part of the marketing team, I also worked with illustrators from the visual design, from the um, home decor team and from the illustration team. I worked with the e-commerce team, I worked with sales, and I worked with developers even. So it was a very out of my league role because that was not something that I was used to at all. And then in terms of work, as I said, I did marketing, newsletters, branding, social media, and in-store communications. So I typically structure my portfolio in this way where like I give some context before diving into anything deeper. So that's exactly what I'm doing right now, right? So I have work and marketing, newsletters, branding, and social media. So right now I'll be getting into marketing newsletters because that was where the crux of my time was spent. And that's also where I had more measurable outcomes. So with this project, what we did was we tried several different approaches to see what people would engage with the most. So the first approach was multiple products versus individual products. The hypothesis over there was if you present users with different options, would they go for that? Or if you present them with one option, does that sort of target their focus and target their attention towards this one thing and increase the click-through rates then. And then the next was whether or not to reveal the prices beforehand. Again, the hypothesis over there was if we do reveal the prices, do they just get intimidated and be like, okay, that's a lot, that's too much, I can't afford this, and back away right then? Or does it seem like, okay, this is something that's affordable to me, so do I just click through and go to the next go onto the website? So we actually saw higher click-through rates when we didn't reveal the products prices as opposed to when we did. That might have been because of how Chumbak has priced their products versus how much their audience is actually willing to spend. And the third was sales. So during sales, we also tried several different strategies because this was something that kept happening. I remember for about 3 weeks, we just had sales on and on and on and on. So we tried several strategies over there, and we realized that a simple, bland newsletter that literally screamed what was going on got the best response. And finally, we had this pet-friendly sense. That was where I think that was where the branding influence came in. Because this is something that Chumbak is known for, right? Even if you look through their Instagram stories, you can just see dogs running around. And bringing this aspect in really hiked up our click-through rates because this is something that their audience very clearly relates to. This is something that they are putting forth as their best foot forward. So yeah, that was the first part of my internship, and these experiments essentially saw a rise in engagements from 3% to 5% by the end of the month. And so basically what I just did over there was that I tried to keep the meat of my work right on top and then follow it up with some almost fluff pieces, things that I haven't worked on as extensively, things that were more like side projects to show breadth.
Okay.
So that's what I've done over here. So these are a couple of Instagram stories that I worked on. These are trial room hangers. We try to keep it very bubbly and cute, right? But without, huh?
It does look really nice.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
But we also wanted to do that without bringing in the influence of old Chumbak, which was the quirkier side. And then there were just a bunch of other marketing campaign products that I designed. These were again like the same theme. Quite frankly, it didn't feel like a lot of work by this point because like Chumbak is the kind of brand where like once you've established this a baseline of what the brand looks like, you're kind of just doing the same thing over and over again. So that's kind of what was happening over here with my internship. I felt like by this point I'd completely understood what the requirements were, what kind of colors were okay, what kind of colors were not, and what kind of even iconography and spacing and hierarchy was required.
Right.
And here is a couple of really bad pictures of what my eggs look like. So there you can see the sailboards you can see the buy to get to things
Yeah.
on the go and so on. And I followed this up with recommendation from the brand manager. So she
Okay.
was quite happy with the work I did, and she offered to write something, and I put it up.
That's
But
it.
I kind of regret that now because it was a little tacky. So yeah. And moving on, there is the Solar Labs. So with the Solar Labs, this was about 6 months after I'd worked on Chumbak. I'm just gonna open up the presentation deck because I think that explains what my work better.
Awesome.
So with the Solar Labs, I worked with them for about 4 months, 4 to 4.5 months. This was a contract project. It was not an internship per se. Um, I was a product designer, a sole product designer over there. They did have someone who was working on product, but he was not a designer. So that's pretty much the outline of what you need to know about the Solar Labs.
Okay.
So what was the Solar Labs, right?
Right.
So I felt like it was very important to give a lot of context to this project because this is fairly ambiguous. It took me a month to get used to it, and to expect someone else to get used to it in like a 20-minute presentation, that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
So they were building an enterprise tool to help solar engineers evaluate the validity of their solar plans, if that makes any sense. So basically, their mission was to accelerate the country's transition into solar energy. And the way that they were doing that was by helping solar engineers, who are people who design the layouts of panels for every new house, helping. It was basically like they were building a software to enable that, right? And my role was that I worked as a consultant. I think I mentioned this before, with a cross-functional team. There were lots of developers and product managers, but I was the only designer. I ended up doing a lot of, I would say that my key role was actually facilitation. I don't think I did a lot of design. I did a lot of data visualization. I did some data visualization, some product design, and a lot of research again. So in terms of process, we started off with a couple of alignment meetings, and then this translated into shadowing the users, and followed up by a bunch of interviews. And then I did a lot of facilitating of design decisions, like helping, because I realized by then that they knew a lot about what they were working on. They had the solutions, you just had to like nudge them in the right direction to visualize it. And finally, the last step was designing plus iterating. So as you can see over here, I would say that design was like secondary almost. If you look at this graph, you can see that I spent most of my time facilitating, a lot of time on research and shadowing and interviews, and very little time actually designing.
Right.
So to begin with, I started off with alignment meetings. Back then, I didn't know that that's what I was doing, but that is essentially what I was doing. Back then, I was just kind of like following this hit and miss process where I'd be like, okay, let's try this. That's it. Okay, let's try this. And that failed as well. So that's kind of how I would move about it.
Right.
But we started off with an alignment where Siddharth, who was the CEO of the company, sat down and explained the difference to solar design engineering. And I'm not going to walk you through it because it's very complicated, and I don't think we want to dive into it into that fidelity. But basically, as you can see on the right, it takes about 7 days to work through one proper iteration of a solar design layout. And a few key problems that we identified was that one, the initial reports, it takes about 5 to 6 days to build a rough initial report. Two, the tasks were very repetitive. So there was a lot of time wasted on deleting extra lines, replicating objects, just like really mundane things that you don't really need to think about. And three, generic software. These tools weren't built for solar products. They were built for architecture, or else they were built for just like 3D modeling, maybe. It wasn't a dedicated tool, right? So here, what I've tried doing is that I've tried setting context right up front to substantiate what the problems are, and then follow that up with how I solved the problems and what the solutions finally were, right? And I chose to keep it at 3 problems. Even, I mean, it was a 4-month-long project, so there were obviously lots of smaller problems that I solved.
Right.
But these were 3 initial things that I discovered. And these were more substantial chunks, and I chose to ignore the smaller, less important pieces. So originally, when I first started designing, when I first joined the company, the tool looked something like this. It was a little hard to use in terms of accessibility, in terms of it wasn't fully designed. It was very low fidelity. Like you can just see a bunch, like you can just see like 10 plus buttons here.
Right.
That makes no sense, right? So that is again to set the context of where the project started at and where we took it by the end of the 4 months. And to demonstrate how I was thinking, I tried to break it down into goals. So organizational goals and user goals to show that I can think not just about users, but also about businesses. So over here with organizational goals, there were top three organizational goals was one is make users loyal advocates.
Right.
In this situation, our users were not our customers. So we also had to add value to our customers. And the third was that we had to iterate and fail quickly because it was a startup. So this was more on a higher level organizational goal and it was very important because they were hiring a lot of contractors who would just come in and pick up where someone else left off. So you need that transition to be very smooth for failing quickly, learning quickly, building to learn. And so these were the different things that we discussed during the aligning, and we went on site to Hyderabad for 1 week, I think, about 7 to 8 days, where we started looking at the different parts of the organizational goals, right? So how do we make our users loyal advocates? So what was the people problem that we were actually trying to solve? And the reason I specified it as a people problem is just to make it like really articulate, to be very specific about the what and the why and the how and for whom.
Right.
So that's also how I've structured the people problem, right? So like you have the design engineers, which is who felt like they were wasting a lot of their time, what, and on redundant and repetitive tasks. That's the how. And this sort of sets the tone for the before and then the after. And we iterated a bit. I iterated a bit and settled down on this final how might we question, which was how might we create a solar design tool for solar engineers to evaluate sites in a productive manner. The reason that I specified productive manner was to create this guiding principle of sort about what is the key value that we're trying to bring to the users. And then I've also again covered the who and the what and the why and how. And based on this, I tried to come up with a metric that could validate whether or not we had solved the problem, had solved at least this part of the problem. And for the situation, which was time taken. And at this stage, it gets a little long where I kind of go into the different steps. So for example, with editing, it takes about 45 minutes to edit our design layout. Okay, so this section I'm gonna just quickly sort through because it's gonna get very long otherwise.
Yeah.
So I'm not gonna dive into what was actually happening. I'm just gonna dive into how I've structured the portfolio. So here, I started off by describing the task and also specifying how much time it takes. And over here, I walk you through the process that they currently follow to accomplish this task.
Right.
And then follow that up with the reasons for why it is not an efficient process and this final solution that we came up with. This is then backed up by the new time taken. So that's kind of like establishing the old and the new again. Right. So I think that's a very recurring pattern that I followed over here. So again, I do shadow analysis. Total time is 90 minutes. What it was before, what it is now. Total time, 10 minutes. 3D to 2D, it used to take 90 minutes before, and then after. The after was that we kind of just integrated it into the software. So the total time goes down from 90 minutes to 0 minutes. And then there's stringing, 300 minutes process, what we changed, total time 30 to 60 minutes.
Right.
And so on. And then finally, I sort of just summed this up with, again, the before and the after. So like these are the steps. You can see it over here. And
Yeah.
then the total time taken initially, followed by the total time taken with the new process. And to really drive the message home, big text, how much time I saved. 9 hours of work, just gone, right? Um, and then I dive back into the process, because now that I feel like I've established a sense of, okay, she has done some work, this product has sort of worked, and now I dive into how we solved the second problem, which was iterating and failing quickly, uh, or actually just prioritizing what we've designed so far. Because when you're working with a small team, it is important to plan, right? You can't just go out and be like, okay, so we're just going to design all of this at the same time in this really unrealistic timeline. You've got to plan it out. And we tried a bunch of atypical processes there. We started off with just um, trying to see impact versus feasibility, but that didn't feel substantial enough. And eventually we settled on this process that Brian Chesky followed. Uh, have you heard the podcast Masters of Scale?
No.
No? Okay, so there's this podcast called Masters of Scale where Brian Chesky talks about how they were defining the customer's experience in Airbnb, where they would talk about like what a 1-star experience would look like, or a 2-star experience would look like, and they'd go on to 15 stars. So they have a realistic goal and they have their unrealistic goal. So that's kind of what we did over here, where we said, what would a 1-star experience feel like? That would be SketchUp plus AutoCAD. That's what they currently have. What would a 2-star experience look like? And eventually we settled saying that, okay, we need a 4-star experience. So this is how we prioritize. Like, this is what we're anchoring our product to, because this is what would add the most value to our to our users. And based on this, we started like listing out features saying this is P0, this is P1, this is P2, this is P3, and so on. And we also ran a co-creation study with our with our users, where we asked them to literally say, like, we literally put out the different tasks that they could do, and we asked them to say which of these is the highest difficulty and which of these is the highest priority, like which is the most important, which is the toughest to do. And based on this, I think the slides are misplaced. This was supposed to be above. And based on this, we prioritized our features with the levels and the status. So that was, and then at this phase, we started working remotely. I came back to Bangalore and they went back to Gurgaon. This is when I really got into iterating and failing quickly, because this is when I started executing, right? So a few key problems, again, same format, where I go into 3 key problems, which is too many hands, faster development cycles are important, and seamlessness and consistency are key. I realized that the best way to deal with this, at least back then, what felt like the best way for me to deal with this was to design a design system. So here I kind of go into how we did that, the process of like what the guiding principles are of every element that we pick, and then following that up with what the final results look like. So over here, the next goal was to add value to our customers. Our customers weren't our users. Our users were way at the bottom of the food chain, versus our customers who were our CEOs who were deciding whether or not to pay for the software. And what would add value to our users is not what would add value to our customers. For them, it would often be business driven. It would often be money centric, or it would be output centric. So to deal with that, we came up with a bunch of strategies. I won't dive into them very deeply because, again, there's a lot of context involved. So we designed reports that would help them get better clients. We designed, we made cheaper tools that would have otherwise cost them a fortune. And we also simplified the process of talking to their customers, right? So we built we pitched an product that would help them communicate with their customers. So that's how we added value to them. And finally, I summed this up with a wrapping up section, just to sort of substantiate what I've learned. So a few things that I learned were to be more conscious of my process. Is good design. open communication and open files are very important, especially when you're working remotely, just to be able to be on the same page as the people you're working with and to right, to understand where you're falling short first. And finally, estimating the time required for tasks, because I would often be like, yeah, I can do this in 2 days, but it would actually take me an entire week. And they'd just be like, are you okay? Can you, like, what is happening here? So that was, time management was a very important thing that I learned throughout. And that's about it. So that's
That's a
how.
really in-depth project, and like hats off. That's a really good project actually, in my opinion. So moving on from your case studies, Viva, how was your experience at Obvious?
So I would say that my experience has been largely positive, especially the last 4 months as a full-time employee. I'm absolutely loved every second of it. Um, I really like my role. It's fairly atypical and it's very challenging. It's very interesting. Lots of learning. So I love it. I think one thing that really drew me to Obvious was the culture, because I felt like, despite the fact that everyone was coming from different backgrounds and everyone was had very different experiences, we all had the same values, and that I think is very central to what we are at Obvious.
That's really nice. Can you share more about your work at Obvious?
Sure. So, as I said, my work is fairly atypical. Um, I'm called the chief of staff to Dhruv. Dhruv is the head of design over there. And what this means is that I help him with everything. This means that I work on, some days I work on internal hiring, on hiring. Some days I work on internal frameworks. Some days I work on client communication. Sometimes I work on client projects. Like, so essentially my weeks are very different from each other. And it feels like I'm learning a little bit about a lot. Actually, no, that's not true. It feels like I'm learning a lot about a lot, just because like, okay, go figure this out, and then now figure this out. So it's very interesting.
Nice. Can you tell us more about any project that you worked on at Obvious as a designer?
So as a designer, so typically at Obvious, the way that designers work on projects is a little different from most consultancies, where in most consultancies, as a designer, you would have a specific role and you would be assigned to multiple projects. Versus over here, you have almost a generalist role and you're assigned to one project and you have a team with you. So this team works with you from end to end, and this team also sticks with you for like multiple projects. So for about um, 2 to 3 or even 4 projects, right? So you kind of grow together. For me, it has been a little different because my team is essentially Dhruv at this point. But I have been working on, I have worked on a couple of client projects, not extensively. So for example, for one client project, I helped lead the sprint. This was a banking company. So we were exploring the opportunity of working with them. And over there, I did a lot of research throughout the sprint. This was research plus testing. I cannot get into more about that project. And
That's really fun.
apart from that, I've also worked on another project for this company called X to 10X, where I worked on building people tool. So this was, so for this project, I was put into it during the last mile of it. So I was put into it to help with delivery and to help with solving the last, like, the last set of tough problems that we had.
Right, right.
And in about a week, I'll be put on another client project, sort of. This is again just a sprint. This is just going to be a 1 week thing, 1 week long engagement, at least for now, where Dhruv and I will be conducting a sprint for this nonprofit organization. I'm very excited about that.
Hey, all the power to you. Also, can you tell us more about the hiring process?
The hiring process, of course. I've been doing a lot of hiring, so I can.
Yeah.
So the hiring process at Obvious is 3 steps. So the first is opinion questions. This is the application process where we ask applicants to fill out answers to about 5 questions. These range from what kind of role do you see yourself playing at Obvious? What kind of role do you see Obvious playing in your life? And what your recent design learnings have been? This is just to get the ball rolling to figure out how enthusiastic people are about design, and like just to assess their different skills upfront. And if we do like these answers and we feel like there's a fit over here where like we can add value to this person's career and they can add value to our company's culture, then we will take it forward to the next round, which is a screening call, where they will get on a call with one of our designers. So typically we just talk about their experiences, what they hope to do, and try to understand what kind of designers they think they are, whether or not they see themselves as generalists or specialists, ICs or managers, where their skills lie, where their weaknesses lie, just to touch upon a bunch of different topics just as a feeler. And if this call goes well, we invite them for the third stage, which is a day at Obvious. So this, from the outside, can seem a little strenuous, but it is essentially again split up into two large segments. The first is a portfolio round, where we ask the applicant to present one project of theirs to a panel of designers from Obvious. And this quite often goes on for about 2 hours, sometimes 1 hour. It depends on how each applicant's answers are going. And over there, we're just trying to gauge how well, how they approach problems, how they solve them, how whether or not they're thinking like consultants, whether they're thinking like product designers, and so on and so forth. And this is then followed up by individual interviews with everyone who was on the panel.
Nice. Can you tell us more about the design team? How many designers are there on the team?
Sure. So our design team currently has 18 people. So that would be 16 designers who work on projects, and Dhruv and I who play a more supporting role.
Okay, that's very nice. So, if I had to ask you, what are your top 3 learnings? What would they be?
Right. Okay, so I think my top 3 learnings are: one is take little bets. So I see people do this a lot at Obvious. It's kind of like a prototyping mindset, right? Where you're like, I want to achieve this X vision, which is huge and large and almost unattainable. So I'm going to take a bunch of little bets and fail a little bit every day to reach there. So this, I've seen people around me do that a lot, in terms of not just their projects, not just in terms of building a product, but also in terms of just management styles, where they're like, okay, let's try this for a week. If it fails, then oh well. If it succeeds, then we've accomplished something. Let's try swaying the company's direction in this way. And again, if it fails, oh well. If it doesn't, then we've achieved something. So I think that's one of my favorite learnings. The second would be build to learn. This is something that Dhruv was explaining to me recently, where he was like, lots of people learn to build. They do lots of foundational research, and then they build products to validate or substantiate that. But what we try to do is we favor generative research, where we're trying to build while we're learning. We are building to learn. So I think that's another important learning that I've had recently. And the third would be from this book that I've just finished reading. It's called Startup Nation. So over there they introduce this phrase, Rosh Gadol. It's an Israeli phrase, and it means big-headed. But what they're really talking about is question everything. We almost like question everything to an almost arrogant extent, but without actually crossing the line. So this would mean if you have managers, don't just buy into everything they're saying, question it. Like, be like, why is this happening? What if we tried this? I think that's something that many people could use a lot more of in their lives.
That's really great. That's really good learning. What are some of the things that you're excited about right now that's going in the design industry?
I am excited about a bunch of things. I'm excited about graduating in 4 months.
Okay.
But I'm excited about the work that I'm doing right now. For the design industry, I think I'm really excited about how the market is opening up right now. I think when I started off 3 years ago, things weren't as exciting and they weren't bubbling as much as they are right now. Where like it didn't feel as interconnected. Maybe that's because I wasn't fully into what I was doing. But I think I'm excited about the way that startups are growing very quickly nowadays. The way that people are willing to take heavier, stronger risks, and like the way the country itself is becoming a little more risk friendly. I
Yeah.
think that's what I'm really excited about. I'm excited about how much we can learn about designing for India in that context.
Awesome. What are some of the things that you're learning currently?
I feel like I'm learning a lot. So uh, Dhruv has been pushing me to do a lot of different things. So I feel like I've been learning about a lot of things, right? So I've been learning about dealing with clients, about building relationships, hiring, but not looking at it through the lens of hiring an individual, but hiring for teams. And I've been learning to write better even. So I think I've just been learning a lot. But I think the most important thing that I've learned is to just be more articulate about what I'm doing. Maybe not in the way that I speak, but definitely why I'm doing what I'm doing, being more intentional. So yeah.
Amazing. What kind of stuff do you see yourself doing in the next 5 years?
That's always a really tricky question if you ask me. So I feel like things just change so quickly. Like 4 months ago, I did not think that I'd be working full time at Obvious. 4 months before that, I had no idea that I'd be interning at Obvious. 4 months before that, I had no idea where I'd even be in a year. And I feel like just that the pace at which things are changing has always just left me a little more certain about the direction I want to go in more than what I see myself doing. So in terms of the direction I want to go in, I definitely want to work on bigger and harder problems. I hope to be building maybe a really I mean, I still see myself in India building out a team and a product that I'm really proud of. I think that's vague, but yeah, I also see myself doing that at Obvious.
It's a nice vision. It's a nice vision. So, Vibha, what advice would you be giving to someone who's just starting off in design or who wants to get started off?
So I think one piece of advice that I could have definitely used is that design is a mindset. It isn't so much about having all the answers. It isn't about like pushing pixels. It isn't about the work you're doing as much as it is about enabling the people around you and thinking about every problem with a design mindset. It isn't about having the answers all the time. It's about facilitating and observing and then deriving insights. It's about refraining judgment. And when you're in design school, it almost feels like the hard skills are what matters the most. Or even when you're in a company, it feels like, you know, building amazing forms is what matters the most. Or like product strategy is what matters the most. But I feel like it isn't. The tricky bit is having the design mindset on all the time and knowing how to read between the lines, how to enable other people to solve problems, and how to solve problems with an experimental mindset. Yeah.
So that's really good advice, though. Also, what is the different? What differences have you noticed that are there while you're learning at in a design school compared to when you're working?
So I always felt like what I was learning at design school wasn't enough. I felt like I wasn't being challenged at all, and I felt like it was very shallow. I felt like I was living in a bubble, which is why I was always doing so much freelance work because I was always consciously aware of how surface level design school felt. So I think that design school can help you experiment, but it doesn't help you integrate those values into your life, which is what working at a company has helped me do. So I would say that you definitely, I mean, at least in my experience, I have learned a lot more by working in a company than through design school.
Nice. Also, have you had any experiences with self-taught designers? And if you can share what the difference is between a self-taught designer and a designer from a design school?
I think haven't seen a lot of differences if I'm being honest. Because I feel like maybe that is just the status of the Indian design education right now, where it isn't developed to the extent where students are actually learning quickly
Yeah.
or well enough. So I think that in that regard, I've always felt like it's almost always been the same.
Okay, awesome. Also, Viva, what are your views? Do you feel there are enough number of women in the design industry, or do you think there should be more?
Oh, I definitely think there should be more.
So, what
Yeah,
what
so
suggestion
I
would you
mean,
give, and what's your take on it?
so this is something we talk about a lot at Obvious, and even personally, I've thought about this a lot. Not just in design, but like also in engineering. I feel like what's missing isn't step one, which is increasing the hiring funnel. I think what's missing is step zero, where we've made cultures suitable for women. Because I feel like in so many places, at least in my experience itself, I have felt. I mean, like there's just a lot of misogyny around whether or not women are even capable of doing good work. And it's not just the big things; it's also the little things. And ironing out that is what will really get the ball rolling. And then you can think about step one, which is increasing the top of the funnel, and then being more aggressive about hiring women and so on. But like I feel like if you miss out on making the working conditions acceptable for women, like accepting women into your organization positively, that itself is missing in most places.
Okay, so this was your take, industry-wise, right, or like company-wise? What any suggestion that you would want to give girls who want to get started off in design?
Girls who want to get
Girls
started
or
off in
women,
design,
or like any, like all those who are just started off or want to or should get started off.
right? I think ignoring the naysayers is very important. I at least felt that way when I was in school, where I felt like where I knew that I was being targeted a lot because I was a girl, and they were like, "No, she can't possibly be good at what she does." So I think just ignoring people and having a stubborn sense of belief in what you're doing and just moving all the time helps.
That's really great. Thank you so much, Viva. It's been great knowing your story, and your projects are just amazing. Wish you the best at Obvious and at whatever you do. Would love to catch up with you as well. It's been amazing talking.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Would love to catch up as well. Thank
Awesome.
you.
Thanks for listening to this episode, and I hope you liked it. To check out other episodes and clips from the interview, subscribe to the Whiteboard.fm YouTube channel. Feel free to share your favorite parts of the interview and don't forget to tag us. This podcast is a part of the 10K Designers Network. You can check out other projects on 10kdesigners.com.